Her current research is in Indigenous-led geographies. Both Lara and Sarah are part of the Yandara collective, led by Gumbangir custodian Auntie Shah Smith, which aims to shift camp together towards Gumbangir-led decolonising ways of caring for and as country. Her PhD research drew on the 2014 protests against the G20 leaders meeting in Menjing, also known as Brisbane, to rethink urban anti-capitalist politics and the city in relation to Indigenous struggles. In our seminar today, Lara and Sarah will present their paper on Unsettling Times, Reconstituting the When of Radical Urban Politics. So Lara and Sarah will be speaking for half an hour, which will leave us plenty of time for a Q&A at the end. If you do have questions, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A button down the bottom of your Zoom screen. Otherwise, at the end of the presentation, there will be a chance for you to raise your hand and you can ask your question directly. I would also just quickly like to advise that we will be recording today's presentation. And yeah, I'd like to now hand it over to you, Lara and Sarah. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. It's actually, I thought I had 40 minutes, so I might be a little long. I hope that's okay.
Sorry. I think 40 minutes is so fine. Sorry.
Okay, great. Excellent. Cool. Well, before I begin, I would also like to acknowledge the Awabakal and Worimi peoples on whose lands I live and work and am sitting right now. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to country itself. I'd also like to acknowledge Gumbaynggirr country, which is the land, the unceded country on which Sarah and I work together as part of the Yandara collective, which you heard about in the bio. And I'd also like to extend my respect and acknowledgement to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are joining us here today. Great, so the presentation today is based on a paper that Sarah and I are currently working and writing. And so in particular, we'd really love to hear your feedback and any ideas that you have arising out of the seminar sharing today. I'd forgotten that slide. Okay. A crowd gathers in Roma Street, Meanjin, on Remembrance Day in the so-called Commonwealth nations. Today marks a memorial time for fallen soldiers of the First World War. Yet this crowd also remembers a different war, a war waged between many earlier nations, not overseas, but on these very lands. A war that is still waiting to be acknowledged by many in this settler colonial nation of Australia, a war that is still being fought. A staunch Cooma man and Aboriginal sovereignty activist, Wayne Wharton, addresses the protesters. He reminds them and us that the first war fought on these lands was not fought at Gallipoli, far away in Turkey in World War I, but fought upon the arrival of the British, the frontier wars. Wharton calls out the hypocrisy and ignorance of many people living on these stolen lands, those who would tell Aboriginal people to simply get over invasion whilst pronouncing, lest we forget, for their fallen soldiers of World War I. These same people might forget the fallen soldiers who were Aboriginal that also fell during World War I. In the crowd in Meanjin, I stand, listen and learn. I am there as a non-Aboriginal participant in the protest, a PhD student. I am also here now, speaking to you with Sarah, who was at the time my supervisor and now a colleague and friend. Together, we are trying to practice the responsibility and gift of non-linear time as uninvited guests on Aboriginal land, including on urban lands. Time, multiple, non-linear, multi-directional, multi-dimensional, active, made through and as relationships. How might we engage the temporal dimensions of urban as country towards reconstituting the when of urban struggles? In this, we draw inspiration and a reference point from writer, illustrator, and legal scholar Amberlyn Quay-Mulliner, who comes from the Paliku people of the Pilbara region of Western Australia. In her prose-styled book, Living on Stolen Land, Quay-Mulliner powerfully points out that an awareness of non-linear time is both a responsibility and a gift. A responsibility because individual actions matter powerfully, radiating out across all that would be thought of in a linear sense as past, present, future. And gift, because linear years have never moved anyone so far that meaningful action cannot be taken to address the wounds of settler colonialism. The chance has not been lost for justice, for change. And so in this presentation, we, Lara, myself, and Sarah, try to understand and enact some of our responsibility and gift by speaking back to structures of temporal linearity, particularly in relation to urban radical politics. We seek to contribute to an unsettling of colonising understandings and practices of time as we continue learning our place and responsibilities as non-Indigenous people and academics on stolen lands. In this presentation, we try not to reproduce a linear or teleological narrative and instead speak from and in different times, acknowledging our multi-directional positioning, reflecting and centering time's co-becoming. We draw threads from the week of protests and gatherings that I attend, from follow-up visits for interviews and a research workshop that were the basis of my PhD research, together with insights shared by Indigenous thinkers and Indigenous-led collaborations, in particular, working with the work of Amberlyn Quay-Mulliner's powerful book of prose. This presentation is divided into 3 sections: past, present, future present, and gathering times, in which we work to understand the many ways that times past, present, and future are entangled. In presenting this paper in this way, we aim to refuse both the distance of colonisation from ourselves, this presentation, this time, and on the other hand, the distance of survivance and Aboriginal presence, which is here always, as it always was, always will be Aboriginal land. We aim to acknowledge time's continual becoming in these 3 different iterations and arrangements from which we can learn and support Aboriginal-led futures. Through this presentation, we are led by the teachings of Aboriginal activists from the Decolonisation Before Profit gathering, organised by the Brisbane Aboriginal Sovereign Embassy, that took place to coincide with the G20 leaders meeting in 2014. We are also led by Meanjin country itself, and there are many beings that gathered there as part of the week-long multiple protest actions. Meanjin is situated on the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara peoples. It has been a traditional place of meeting, trading and hunting, with the river, creeks and swamps providing a vital source of nourishment. The gatherings of this week, which include multiple rallies, protest marches, forums, ceremonies and yarning circles, form part of an ongoing struggle led by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander activists, the rightful custodians of these more than human entities. Taking direction from Indigenous epistemologies, ontologies and struggles, we highlight the ways in which more than human agencies and actions at the G20 relate deeply with different temporalities, resituating present-day struggles in much longer and deeper trajectories and relations. From our positions as uninvited guests on Aboriginal lands, we work to deepen urban geographical engagements with the urban as country, thinking through what a temporally rich notion of the urban might mean for differentially positioned struggles in and over urban lands. How might struggles situated on stolen lands work to decenter settler futurity and instead nurture Indigenous futures? Back at the rally I'm attending, Wharton now calls in Dundalli, a chosen warrior, who defended and continues to defend the area where the crowd gathers, as well as the wider area of Meanjin. As a consequence, Dundalli is hung as a criminal by the British nearby. Wharton urges the crowd to call Dundalli's name as we walk the city in protest, crying "Genocidal 20, leave our lands alone." He invites protesters to acknowledge Dundalli's presence as we march through the CBD and cross the river to Kurilpa, place of the water rats. And so Dundalli's name rings out through the city, sung by the voices of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal protesters alike. The crowd moves through the streets, marching the city in times with Dundalli. Through Dundalli's calling in and the crying out of his name through the streets, Dundalli is made present in the time and space of the protest. The presence of Dundalli's warrior spirit on the march is not simply a memorialisation of his life, static and contained in the past. Rather, he is part of an intermingling of times, past, present, his presence alive, ongoing and active in the city. His presence in Meanjin serves as a powerful reminder of the multiple, more than human presences that co-constitute the urban as country in so-called Australia. Dundalli is of the past and of the present. He makes the present now. He makes present previous iterations of sovereignty struggles that were continued through the G20 protests and are ongoing today. Dundalli throws into stark relief the ongoing nature of colonisation in places like so-called Australia, where colonisers come to stay, renaming Indigenous lands as home and property. Dundalli is a warrior who fights against invasion, both before and after he was hanged. His presence in Meanjin on the protest march unsettles the seemingly settled colonial relations of place and time. For me and other non-Aboriginal activists in the march, this is an invitation to stay with the difficult realities of invasion and survivance, to face up to privilege and complicity, to struggle to dismantle some of those colonising structures that continue to make invasion an ongoing reality. To respond in some way to Quay Mullina's question, you are on stolen land. What can you do about it? Meanjin is stolen land. It is always already country. As a warrior, Dundalli's presence insists on an acknowledgement of positionality and relationship to place in ways that are not easy. His ongoing life and ongoing death mean that thinking about place and positionality cannot be a matter of tokenistic gesturing or feel-good acknowledgement. Because if, as it is, the past is in the present, as Dundalli still lives and is violently hanged, as the presence of ongoing invasion lays the grounds for myself and Sarah to be here, there is a reality of ongoing complicity that must be faced, ongoing privilege built on violence that must be addressed. Those who have died, been murdered, are still here. Colonialism is not just a legacy of the past, but is here, the past in the present, making the present all that it is. And in this, it is not just activists in Meanjin that day who might heed the call to respect the urban as unceded country. It is Sarah and I, as well as urban activists and urban geographers, indeed geographers more broadly, who are living as uninvited guests on unceded country, or are themselves Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, continuing their culture and relationships in the midst of ongoing colonisation. As Dallas Hunt suggests, ultimately, there is much work that white people and other settlers need to do that is not the responsibility of Indigenous peoples. Understanding the past in the present is not an academic novelty, but rather a lived reality long understood with living multi-generational impacts on custodians, settlers and country. The urban country of Meanjin grounds much of the thinking in this paper, the ways it communicated and taught with Aboriginal activists through the week of protest and gatherings. We, Sarah and myself, think and work together with Meanjin as settlers, as inheritors of violent dispossession. Some of my ancestors came to Australia as convicts, and others arrived in the mid-1800s from Ireland, Scotland, England, and Denmark. All became beneficiaries of the theft of Aboriginal lands. Sarah was born in Sydney on Gadigal country to first-generation English migrants who arrived in Australia as 10-pound POMs. Their travel heavily subsidised to the cost of £10 by the Australian government, solely because they were white and British, in an effort to shore up the racist, imperial and capitalist project of whiteness in and as Australia. Living with uncomfortable truths. On the southern side of the river is Musgrave Park, traditional home to the Kalparam Yuggan people and part of Kurilpa, place of the water rats. Musgrave Park holds space for the decolonisation before profit gathering, as the G20 leaders meeting takes place at the Brisbane Convention Centre across the road. The gathering here of Aboriginal elders, community, activists and their non-Aboriginal allies is hosted by the Brisbane Aboriginal Sovereign Embassy. This parkland is home to the embassy and has been an important meeting place for First Nations people since time began and still is today. Musgrave Park is a place of ongoing Aboriginal presence and resistance in urban time space, a refusal to be erased by the colonising urban development and discourse. Aboriginal presence defies the temporal manoeuvres of dominant urban discourses that work to contain Aboriginal presence in a non-urban past. As scholar and Murray woman from southeast Queensland, Bronwyn Fredericks argues, dominant framings of authentic and traditional culture can position Aboriginal people within a timeless and static setting where we are generally represented in the bush, on a hill, or in a remote community, rather than belonging to an urban present. Yet Aboriginal presence is still here on the grounds of Musgrave Park and Meanjin today, an undeniable presence made visible on Aboriginal terms in this week of protest, asserting belonging not just to the past, but firmly to the present. The words themselves, still here, emanate from the grounds of Musgrave Park, speaking back to attempts to remove Aboriginal presence and sovereignty from the urban present. The uttering of these words are embodied claims to urban country that still belongs to Aboriginal people. Still here rings out in the rallies and marches each morning, the speeches and the yarning. These shouts, utterances and physical reverberations assert the indelible presence of Indigenous resistance and relationships to, with and as the urban present. One of the non-Aboriginal participants at Musgrave Park later says, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander participants in the gathering, existing was just like a big fuck you, we're still here. Fuck you, we're still here. And the number of times people said that phrase, still here, I just heard it throughout the whole week. It was beautiful. It was this theme, this rhythm that went through the week. Still here, still fucking here. And just that is enough at the moment. Let's celebrate that. And fuck you to all those trying to stop us being here. And that was acutely present in the extent to which the state mobilised its force during the G20, but also historically too. Those Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ways of being are still there. I found that really powerful. These reflections contextualise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander presence today in wider and deeper sets of relations with time and place. Indigenous presence is still here, weaving the threads of an urban fabric that is much more than settler time and space. It is always already country, and since invasion, always a site and agent of struggle. In a context of ongoing war, of ongoing settler colonial dispossession, Indigenous presence defies attempts to contain Indigenous sovereignty in the past and rebinds Aboriginal relationships with urban places today. Still here. Today, at Musgrave Park, the next generation of sovereignty activists and Aboriginal community leaders gather in Yagara Hall for a Young People's Forum and the launch of WAR, an Australia-wide collective of the warriors of Aboriginal resistance. The young sovereignty activists are learning from their elders to nourish survivances and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander futurities through struggle. They are elders' future and so present. Me and other non-Aboriginal people are told that we are welcome to sit in and listen, but we're asked to sit out of discussions to enable space for Aboriginal people to talk and plan. In the Young People's Forum, warriors urge other young Aboriginal people to go back to country and emphasise the importance of Aboriginal people sorting our own stuff out. In doing so, country comes in strong in spite of ongoing colonisation, going back to country being a source of strength, nourishment and guidance. Yet going back to country does not mean stepping back in time to a past cut off and separate from the present. Rather, it is to engage the past in the present, to acknowledge the richness of multiple and interacting times that co-become with and as country. Times that Yunker and Bullen describe as existing everywhere at all times, like a pond you can swim through, up, down and around. War makes explicit the connections between country and commingling times in their political praxis of resist, revive, decolonise. For war, going back to country is, quote, protecting and upholding the two most important relationships that exist, our relationship with the land and our relationship with each other, end quote. Country, for war, enacts a multi-directional temporal political praxis of engaging the past, present and future as entangled in struggles in the here and now, resisting ongoing colonisation, reviving old ways of knowing and being, and decolonising offers a political orientation that is neither wholly forward-facing nor backward-facing in time, drawing on relationships and ways of knowing and being with place that are dynamic and evolving, yet exist in and foreground deep times. Such temporalities of struggle reconstitute the when of struggle, revealing the urban as a rich, multidimensional temporal terrain. As the Young People's Forum in Yuggera Hall concludes, non-Aboriginal activists are called to integrate their learning into their own understandings of struggle and to take responsibility for doing something with that learning. For me, an Aboriginal-led political praxis of resist, revive, decolonise calls for a rethinking of temporal practices involved in social change on unceded Aboriginal lands. How and what kind of future is being made in the present? I go to sit with my friends in Musgrave Park, shaded by a fig tree. Our group discusses the responsibility called for by war and the Brisbane Aboriginal Sovereign Embassy, reflecting on what forms it might take, and begins to grapple with the ways that resist, revive, decolonise calls into question the very precepts of struggle, particularly as practiced by non-Aboriginal activists. What futures are being created by urban struggles, and whose futures do they nourish? For there are other activities happening in Meanjin in response to the G20, activities that have not been organised by the Brisbane Aboriginal Sovereign Embassy. These activities come under the banner of the People's Convergence and are taking place parallel to and in solidarity with the events hosted by the Embassy at Musgrave Park. This week, the People's Convergence is enacting their own temporal practice of visioning alternative futures, demanding a world safe from the ravages of climate change, a world with good jobs, clean air and water, and healthy communities. The People's Convergence program centres the role of capital and calls for participation in a community-generated response to G20-driven economic systems and for a bottom-up visioning of another world. Implicit in this call is continuity with the altered globalisation cycle of struggles, which propose that another world is possible in response to corporate globalisation. Broadly, this politics involves the rejection of the hegemonic pairing of neoliberalism and liberal democracy and proposes the construction of alternative forms of democracy and a redistributive economic agenda. Yet this approach does not necessarily engage the distinct forms of Aboriginal law and governance that cannot be collapsed into notions of a more radically democratic future society. In this way, practices of visioning a socially just world can work to diminish important differences between struggles and recenter settler futurities. As Sandy Grand poignantly asks, how does egalitarian distribution of colonised lands constitute greater justice for Indigenous peoples? Accordingly, Grand insists any liberatory project that doesn't begin with a clear understanding of the difference of Indigenous sovereignty will in the end work to undermine it. As it was, Meanjin, Dundalli, and the powerful voices of organisers from the embassy pulled me and my friends into different learning and different activism throughout the week. I attended the People's Convergence activities with increasing discomfort. The project of visioning a more socially, economically, and environmentally just world began to feel like a project perilously close to a project of ensuring settler futurity. As Dallas Hunt, a member of the Swan River First Nation in what is now known as Canada, poses, what happens when we try to decenter the settler and their presumed futures? What does it work when settlers proclaim allyship, yet have strong investments in colonial futures? It is this question that animates me and my group of friends as we sit under the fig tree in Musgrave Park. Clearly, there are different responsibilities around this for settler, migrant, and for Aboriginal people in Australia. What is clear is that in Australian cities, decolonisation struggles arise out of distinct Aboriginal relations to the urbanist country. As such, in their call to action, the Brisbane Aboriginal Sovereign Embassy proposes a systemic transformation based on, quote, Aboriginal culture and values as a solution to the greed and discrimination of the present colonial power structure. Acknowledging Aboriginal sovereignty, envisioning better futures, is not equivalent to centering the Aboriginal sovereign relations described by War in their anti-capitalist praxis. Rather, to construct something distinct or counter to the settler state, struggles proceeding on stolen Indigenous lands must be willing to centre relationships with Indigenous governance structures in order to nourish and strengthen Indigenous futurities, including on and as urban country. This creates an opening for understanding the city as a temporally rich entity, a complex web of human and more than human co-becomings with and as time and place. It is part of living responsibilities of non-linear time. Sharing some of the teachings of the Gongurfa song spiral, a Yolngu song spiral from northeast Arnhem Land, which sings up the keeper of the fire, the Bawaka Collective consider what the song spiral teaches about responsibility in the context of ongoing Eurocentric colonising pressures. Attending to Bawaka-led relational ontologies, they point out two key aspects of responsibility, response and ability, that require an ability to pay close and careful attention as part of more than human worlds, and an imperative to respond as, rather than to be responsible to or responsible for what is communicated in more than human, situated, and ethical ways. This notion of responsibility as refuses distance and linearity, and both requires an ability to pay close and careful attention as part of more than human worlds, and an imperative to respond as part of these worlds. What might this understanding of responsibility mean for a multi-temporal urban politics? What does it mean for Amble and Quaymulina's call to attend to the gift and responsibility of non-linear time? As Quaymulina suggests, the linear version of time that settlers brought with them to so-called Australia creates distance. It claims that, quote, things that happened 100 years ago are further away than things that happened yesterday. Quaymulina writes that this is a version of time that is always carrying people away from an unchangeable past into an unknowable future, giving the illusion of progress, regardless of whether anything has changed. In contrast, a relational view of time, in which time is lived and embodied, has never moved anyone so far that meaningful action cannot be taken. This is a responsibility that speaks to the co-becoming of people and country, place and time. It is a responsibility that situates past, present and future as entangled in the here and now. A relational time and its associated responsibilities are measured by the degree to which relationships have been affected, healed, or brought into balance. I convened a workshop after the G20, bringing together people who had reconnected with each other through time spent in protest in Mianjin. The group comes together to think about what the G20 moment means for an ongoing political praxis. Sitting around the community centre table, the group grapples with the many times invoked by decolonisation, its multiple invitations and responsibilities, depending on who we are and from where we come. Discontinuous relations between past, present and future are empowered by Western linear notions of time that allow settler responsibility to be cast elsewhere, estranged from the present, forgotten, ignored. At the workshop in Mianjin, reflecting on the G20 protests and a refusal to be cast elsewhere, an Aboriginal participant points out, people who claim to be anti-capitalist still tend to forget the continuing process of genocide. Like people think when they talk about decolonisation, it's something we've got to decolonise from our past, but it's something that's continuous, we've got to prepare for. It is something continuous, this work against colonisation, this support of Indigenous presence, something to be continually acted upon, prepared for. It cannot be moved to the future or the past. Urban political movements, including anti-capitalist struggles then, must be aware a Western paradigm of progress, including its revolutionary instantiations, within which the future is positively valued as a time space where present distress can be claimed as leading towards a more perfect future, further alienating responsibilities in and to the present. The privileging of the future as a time space of restitution directs responsibilities toward the future to the detriment of the present. In contrast, rethinking times as entangled and multiple suggests a different relationship to time for all struggles on stolen lands. Entangled times brings a focus on connection, relationship, and co-becoming. As the keeper of the fire, Gongurtha suggests, one way into embracing this is through a recognition that you do not have responsibilities to a place or for a person or issue, but as a place, as the person, as the issue. This reconfiguring of responsibilities goes beyond the individual, and it demands that connections and relationships are acknowledged and privileged. As the group of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal activists begin to reckon with their learning from Mianjin and the G20, they foreground the temporality of all struggles taking place on Indigenous lands. This is the responsibility to the present, as one of the workshop participants comments. I think for decolonisation to be a political concept that's important and relevant, we need to think of colonisation not as this thing that happened 200 years ago, which we can't do anything about, but recognise that it's an ongoing thing where you can do decolonisation. It's recognising colonisation as an ongoing reality and challenging that, and where you can learn from the past. That's important. But when it comes to this term decolonisation, for me, that term has worth in stopping future colonisation and present colonisation. And the gift? The gift is the chance for relationships to be made and remade across and as time, with and as country. The chance for connections and co-becomings. For one Aboriginal person, a staunch and inspiring presence throughout the week of protests, this gift involves appreciation of other more than human time scales and understandings, glimpsing how much growth there could be if these realities were more broadly nourished. As they say, and for such a young country, we're only 150 years old and being called Australia. There are turtles in this country that live for 150 years. And just looking through the eye of a turtle at how this nation has changed, that would be pretty freaky. But also realizing how not so mature this nation is and how much it could grow if it accepted the reality Australia has created for itself and the people who are disadvantaged here. How we Aboriginal people could be a leading force in this country. In the crowd, in Meanjin, and in this Zoom, we might all take part from our different places with our different ancestors and different co-becomings. We might all reflect on our diverse, divergent, but nonetheless connected responsibilities and gifts. Dundalli and the many other urban Aboriginal presences at the G20 are ongoing constituents of the city and urban struggles, not just this week, but all weeks. Such presences continue to remake urban country, creating complex and multi-layered terrains of urban struggles in and as the city. Together, as we are in the crowd from our different places, we might deepen the engagements of geographical and anti-capitalist politics with the specificities of stolen lands and country. Differentially positioned as we are as settlers, migrants, Indigenous and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, our response and ability will look different as we might bring richer understandings to geographical conceptualizations and as we work towards decolonising the city. Thanks.
Thanks, Lara. That was extremely powerful, and I feel like we can all reflect on how we decolonize our past and futures, and living with these uncomfortable truths, as you mentioned as well. I was really moved by your reflections on how the past and present and the future are entangled with more than human entities as well. So we have about 20 minutes left, so we've got a bit of time for questions. So please, if anyone has any questions, put them in the Q&A button down the bottom, or you can raise your hand and one of the panel members can find you and you can speak directly if you want. We've got one question already, which is great. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. What sense of home and belonging might a settler legitimately strive for as an uninvited guest in an Australian city, even if they practice responsible ability? Did you want to answer that, Lara or Sarah?
Yeah, is there a way that I can see it as well?
Yes, of course.
If I stop sharing?
Yeah, if you, and then down the bottom, there should be a little number 1 down the Q&A.
Oh yeah, cool.
You should be able to see.
Oh, awesome. I'm just trying to think how to answer this. I guess what's tripping me up is the legitimately aspect of it. I guess I see it as a responsibility to strive for that. That is part of the responsibility, for me, is to try and work to build relationships that unsettle the kind of settler belonging. So, and that kind of comes across in all different aspects of life, in everything that we do, from the kinds of micro practices within our disciplines, right up to kind of bigger institutional change. And I guess for me, like over recent years, it's kind of twofold. It's like, how do I think about this in terms of my research, and how do I think about this in terms of my life? And so, yeah, and I guess like a major part of that is being led as much as possible by invitations from custodians, elders and activists, which come in all kinds of forms. It might be an invitation to a rally and showing up for that. It might be some kind of interaction that you have with country itself, be it you know, the visitation of a crow. Like, it can come in all kinds of forms. And just for me, I guess, trying to be open to these multiple invitations and to step up wherever I can is kind of how I approach that. Sarah, did you want to add anything to that?
Thanks. No, I agree very much, Lara, with your answer. I guess also a sense of belonging that is embedded in the notion of responsibility and the sense of responsibility and gift, as comes through Kwamulana's poem, in the sense that it's perhaps a belonging that is built in a more, or that's understood and comes about through more kind of tentative, even kind of modest relationships, that's looking for invitations, and that is seeking to understand the hurt and the violences that are in the present, so that it's not kind of not looking to sort of move away and sort of have something magicked away and become innocent in any way, but actually takes on some of the complexities of the relationships and tries to lean in towards the responsibilities. And as I says, the sense of it as a gift, like not necessarily seeing that as a bad or terrible thing that should go, but that to be able to kind of listen to those invitations and to hopefully look for opportunities to do things differently is in itself a positive kind of emergent belonging.
Yeah, and I guess like something else I would think in the forefront of that is relating to Indigenous governance systems and sovereignty, and kind of like, as a settler, I can't belong in a non-colonizing way until those are taking their rightful place in leading this country. So yeah, I guess that would be another component to that.
Great. That was a really interesting question. Thank you for those answers as well. David, did you want to unmute yourself and ask?
Yeah, sure thing. Hi, Lara. Hi, Sarah. That was a really fantastic presentation, really powerful. Still digesting lots of the things that you talked about. I guess one of the things that I was really struck by at this, close to the start of the presentation, was talking about staying with the difficulties, so the kind of complicity and the difficulties of this work of dismantling. And so I guess in that respect, I'm really interested to hear a little bit more from you, Lara, about maybe the difficulties of staying with the difficulties. So the labor, the hard work, the very visceral bodily exhaustions and depletions that were sort of invoked at various points in your presentation, for both yourself, but also maybe for Aboriginal activists too. And other particular kind of techniques, kind of care techniques, or other ways of dealing with that? Or is it about becoming comfortable with sitting with those discomforts? Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, like I recently had a couple experiences where the importance of that discomfort has become really clear to me again. I think like that discomfort comes up in many different times, and has through my PhD in trying to, so when I started, I kind of initially entered through the people's convergence side of things, having had that history of being in convergence protests as an anti-capitalist kind of politics, but was then really struck and called through the engagements that I had during the G20 to centre and really take up some responsibilities around, well, how do these things sit together or not sit together, this kind of anti-capitalist politics and the Indigenous-led politics that was going on at the time. And so, you know, that was uncomfortable for me. It's like a calling out. I very much see myself as being part of that problem that I'm talking about in the in anti-capitalist politics and the way that we have visioned futures. Yeah, and then, but oh gosh, I'm losing my train of thought. But basically, I think what I want to say is that discomfort is essential. And I think I'm starting to realize that when that discomfort goes away is usually when mistakes are made. And those mistakes are important too. But I definitely think for me, it's about just, and that's part of the responsibility, is sitting with that discomfort and working through it and doing what I can to learn from it and be aware that I'm always going to make more mistakes as well. And that's part of the process of learning. And I think that's been really key in the work that Sarah and I are doing as part of Yandara is, you know, we might strive to do our best and we try and think of things, but we are inevitably going to make mistakes, and that's part of the process. And we need to, and having to have really clear conversations about that. Yeah, and then processes too, I guess. I think recently some things that have come up for us have kind of reminded us of how important processes for when things go wrong are, and how, I guess, in terms of tools and techniques, it's like paying attention to those kinds of things as well is something that we could definitely do better.
That's brilliant. Thanks so much, Lara.
Thanks, David.
Yeah, brilliant question, David, and thanks, Lara, for your response. We have a couple more questions in the Q&A chat. They're a bit long, so you might want to read back through them. So Craig said, great presentation, thank you. How are people that you are working with discussing the present itself? Is the present an event now, or as it might be in some major protest, or is it the present? Is the present the constantly moving filament of time, a more everyday sense of the present, or is it the present more the current conjuncture, e.g. post-COVID Australia in 2021, or is it all of the above?
I think the best way, Sarah might help me out on this too, the way that so most of my work right now is not so much is not in Meanjin, but is in the collaborations on Gumbaynggirr country with Sarah, which is led by Auntie Shah and her daughter Nian Smith and Uncle Bud Marshall. And I think in our work there, the present has more of that entangled times aspect to it. Like the past is continuing now. We're kind of reconnecting and recreating the story of the past in the present now and building the future within that moment. So something we talk about is creation stories, and how the creation story that Auntie Shah shares with us is not of the past, it's as much of the present, and that those beings and co-becomings and agencies are very much a part of country and our story today. So I think in that way, that's why we kind of talk about the entanglements of time as how we're trying to get to that sense of how all those different times interact and relate. Do you have anything to add to that, Sarah? My time wormhole.
No, except I suppose if looking at those, if I needed to sort of say one that kind of resonated more was this idea of kind of conjuncture, in a sense, in that it, as Lara was saying, like with Auntie Shah, would be particularly drawing upon an idea of now that really is those other times. It's not sort of a metaphor or an abstraction, but very much so. I actually was just thinking as well of another example. Just on the weekend, I was at a protest around some proposed logging on Gumbaynggirr country, and one of the elders, Auntie Allison, got up and read a letter out that had come from the forest, state forest saying that the logging wasn't going to happen, and everybody who was there at the camp was feeling so great and just so relieved and happy, and there was a lot of kind of like, whoa, and she let that go. She was then talking about the sort of energy and the creation in Gumbaga country, and everyone was just in this state of really beautiful kind of celebratory moment, and she let that kind of go for a bit, and then sometime later said, oh, by the way, that letter it's not here yet. You needed to share that feeling in the now so that you know the celebration that's going to come when we win. And I just thought I'd share that example of that, some of that sense of like really trying to bring that kind of future into the present, and that through kind of effective relationships to what's going on. And it was also part of what she was doing was also bringing the ancestors, or acknowledging the ancestors that are here now in the present as well. So it's it's more than entanglement in a way, it's this co-becoming of the times. Yeah.
That's absolutely fascinating. It just strikes me, Lara, the way you phrased the present as a continuation of the past is a really interesting conceptual counterpoint to a lot of the writing, as you might know, around the Occupy movement and Howard Zinn, and the notion there that the present is the first moment in the future. So the argument there was, the future is nothing but an ongoing succession of presents that starts now, and we're performing the future, which is radical in a certain way. But there's some very interesting potential to sort of rethink that in relation to thinking about the present as a continuation of the past. I find that fascinating. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. And I'll definitely look up Howard Zinn's writing too on Occupy. I haven't been reading that lately, so that sounds
I'll send
great.
you some stuff. Yeah,
that would be awesome. Thank you. Yeah.
So we have another question from William, but I accidentally put it into the answer section. So if you did want to read it back, it's in that. If it's next to the open section, got that there. So it's I really appreciated your call for geographers to recognise urban landscapes as always already country embedded in the past, present and future. How would you see this recognition changing the way that urban geographers do research? Does this responsibility extend beyond your research into personal life?
Yeah, for sure. How would you say so? Yeah, on the first part, on the research, like for me, it's about seeing that this relates, like being always on country, this relates to all research. It doesn't matter whether it's about specific Indigenous issues or whether just whatever it is, it's always taking place on country. And so to me, it would be amazing for us to radically rethink all our research in relation to that, and in relation to, well, what does this research have to do with those responsibilities around country and around sovereignty? So I think that could take place in all kinds of areas. So in terms of our funding applications, and well, how do we build into our applications that acknowledgement of where we're researching, whose lands they are. And then our ethics applications, the same kinds of things. How do we really build in that acknowledgement? And something that we've thought about as Yandara Collective, and we're writing about this too, is about the consent of country. So rethinking our consent practices so that they're not only attending to human research participants, but the more than human research participants of the country that we're on and country itself. So yeah, I think in our research, this stuff is relevant to all of us, and the responses will be different depending on what we're researching, who we are, where we're from, all that richness of positionality and responsibilities. And then, yeah, I absolutely do think too that it goes into personal life as well. I don't see personal and research as separate at all. So yeah, and I think engaging in this kind of research also does blur the boundaries of of the personal and work, but in a positive way, not in a like exploitive capitalist way of you must work all the time, but in a way that's just like, this is life, this is part of who we are, and we need to attend to these things in all dimensions. Yeah, so I guess that's stuff I try and consider, as well as I'm sure many other people here do as too.
That's great. Sarah, did you want to add anything? Great. Well, if anyone has any other quick questions, we've got 2 minutes. Otherwise, we might wrap up unless someone has a burning question. No.
Could I just make another comment?
Yes, of course, please.
Sorry, right. Thanks so much, everyone, for your really interesting questions. I'm really excited. It's kind of great to hear. I might be able to copy them down and ponder them some more. Also, I want to acknowledge like the risk in doing a presentation like this and coming across as though I think I'm a good settler or I think I know all the answers, because that's absolutely not the case. Yeah, I don't know the answers. I'm trying to figure it out. I think, and I'll always be trying to figure it out. So I hope that none of my answers have given any sense that I know the answer, because I certainly don't. But it's great to have the conversation together.
Yeah, no, it was awesome to have you, Lara and Sarah. Thank you so much. And I'm sure that, yeah, I think there's a few comments and questions in there that there's room for engagement as well. If you want to connect with others, we're happy to kind of connect. Yeah, great. So that's it for this seminar. But next week we will be having a presentation by Laura Sonter from the University of Queensland, and she'll be presenting a talk on mining threats to biodiversity and the consequences of a green energy transition. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Lara and Sarah. It was so lovely to hear from you both.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you.